Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
Hello, co-stars, and welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is American Ben. Today, we're going to continue our coverage of First Man, a movie that sounds like it should be a Mel Gibson-directed epic starring The Rock as a prehistoric caveman who has to defend his tribe against an evil chieftain who plans to use the newly invented wheel technology to take over the world. But because it's not the 80s anymore, it tells the story of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. Anyway, last time we judged the film for historical accuracy, so this time we're going to talk about what the film left out. First up, it wasn't always so clear that Armstrong would be the first to step on the moon. One thing that was left out of the film was the reasoning as to why Armstrong was the first to step on the lunar surface. Many people just assumed that as commander of the mission, Neil Armstrong should obviously have been the first out of the lander. However, in 2014, Buzz Aldrin did an Ask Me Anything on Reddit in which he explained how NASA decided which astronaut it would be. Aldrin implied in his answer that he implored NASA to let him be the first one, but not because of the historical importance of the moment. He explained that commanders are already burdened with an enormous amount of responsibility and obligations, and so he felt it was his job to be the first to step on the moon and perform the initial tasks required on the lunar surface so Armstrong could stay in the lunar module and focus on other tasks. As Aldrin wrote, in all previous missions, if someone, a crew member, was to spacewalk, it was always the junior person, not the space commander who would stay inside. We knew this would be different because two people would be going out. In other words, typical mission protocol called for Aldrin, the junior officer among the two, to be the first to step out on the moon. Aldrin continued, there was a group at NASA who felt the junior person, me, should go out first, but many people felt the great symbology of the commander from past expeditions or arrivals at a destination. The decision that was made was absolutely correct as far as who went out first, symbolically. And the decision wasn't up to me or Neil, it was up to the people much higher up in NASA. In other words, the choice to veer from protocol was based on the symbology of the mission's commanding officer leading the way onto the moon. NASA's history website tells a little bit of a different story. Their series Apollo Expeditions to the Moon explains that once Apollo 11 was determined to be the mission to land on the moon, some NASA officials assumed that Aldrin would be the first to step on the lunar surface. Why? Because in Project Gemini, which ran from 1961 to 66, the man in the right-hand seat of the spacecraft, Aldrin in this case, had done the EVA or extravehicular activity, and engineers at NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center had called for this protocol in an early timeline they drew up for the Apollo 11 mission. However, the lunar module's hatch opened on the opposite side, and so for Aldrin to get out first, he would have had to climb over Armstrong. And given that both men would be in bulky suits with bulky packs, this would have been very hard to do, and in simulations attempting this, the lunar module mock-up was damaged. On the other hand, Deke Slayton, the astronaut's boss at the time, added that along with the logistical challenges, there was an element of rank that played a factor. As he explained, just on a pure protocol basis, I figured the commander ought to be the first guy out. I changed it as soon as I found they had the timeline that showed that Aldrin would be first. So there seems to have been a few factors at play here. But one thing that is widely agreed on is that Armstrong in no way pulled rank or pushed NASA to let him be first. Next up, the American public wasn't fully in support of the moon mission. First Man showed a brief montage of different groups of American citizens criticizing the Apollo 11 mission. This was largely the only picture of the American public that the film provided, and little information was offered about why this was shown at all. Although American history seems to always portray Americans as being obsessed with the moon and overwhelmingly in support of space exploration, this just isn't true. When expanding the space program is talked about today, sometimes you'll hear people say, I don't think we should have wasted money on that, or shouldn't we focus on our country before other planets? Well, those voices were a very large part of the American public back in the time of the Apollo missions. According to Space.com, public support of continuing human lunar exploration almost never surpassed 50% during NASA's Apollo program. And in the years leading up to the moon mission, Americans often ranked spaceflight near the top of programs they'd like to see cut in the federal budget. The first time more than half of the American public believed the Apollo program was worth the expense was at the time of the moon landing itself, when Armstrong stepped onto the moon. And even then, only 53% of the American public believed it was worth the cost. So with such tepid support, how did so much funding for space exploration get approved throughout the 60s? The answer is the Soviet Union. While the public support wasn't there, in the midst of the Cold War, politicians and presidents saw the greater political purpose in the space program of advancing America's standing in the world in contrast to the Soviets. Next up, Neil Armstrong didn't spend that much time walking on the moon. One thing that the film wasn't able to accurately portray is that Armstrong and Aldrin's moonwalk didn't last that long. As Armstrong himself wrote, NASA officials limited their lunar surface working time to 2.75 hours to ensure that the astronauts would not die from hyperthermia, or above average body temperatures. You see, the moon's temperature can range from 260 degrees Fahrenheit in the day to a negative 280 degrees Fahrenheit at night, or 1,237 and negative 8,456 degrees Celsius respectively. The reason for the extreme temperatures is that the moon has no significant atmosphere, so it can't trap heat or insulate its surface. When Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon, temperatures were well above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and the astronauts relied on water-cooled suits to keep them from overheating. But they had no idea how long the water tanks in their backpacks would last, so to be safe, their moonwalk had to be limited to under 3 hours. Additionally, the astronauts never strayed more than 100 yards from the lander. NASA officials wanted them to remain in sight of the TV camera on the lander so they could learn from the mission. Though Armstrong did leave the camera view for a brief time to photograph the interior crater walls for possible bedrock exposure. In any case, Armstrong and Aldrin had a lot of tasks to complete and wouldn't have been able to roam around much even had they been allowed to. Astronauts on subsequent NASA missions to the moon were allotted much longer periods of time on the lunar surface and could travel farther from their landers, especially with the advent of the lunar rover in 1971. Next up, the meaning of the alarm code. As Armstrong and Aldrin attempt to land the lunar module on the moon's surface, we hear an alarm go off for code 1202, but it isn't made clear in the film what that means. In reality, after the two astronauts separated from the command module for their descent to the moon's surface, they faced a whole host of challenges. Mission control on Earth was having radio issues, and communication between them and the lunar module kept fading in and out. It was so bad that flight director Gene Kranz would have had to order an abort if it got any worse. In the middle of all this, some 6,000 feet above the surface of the moon, the lunar module guidance computer sounded the 1202 alarm.
1202 alarm. Yeah, and the same thing we had.
Flight, retro.
Go retro.
Throttle down, 6 plus 25. Give us the reading on the 1202 program alarm. We're going that flight.
Neither astronaut knew what this meant, and they couldn't look it up because they had to watch where they were going. But it's also not the type of alarm one can hit snooze on. So when Armstrong finally got into contact with Mission Control and asked them about it, Guidance Officer Steve Bales told him it was safe to continue as long as the alarm was intermittent. The alarm indicated an executive overflow, meaning that the computer was not able to handle all of its tasks in real time and would have to delay some of them. Bales has since explained that it would have been just as dangerous to abort with a bad computer as it would be to continue the landing. So weighing risk against risk, they went ahead with the mission. Within minutes of getting the order to keep going, another alarm actually went off, this time with error code 1201, but it was the same class of warning, so they were still good to move forward.
1201. 1201.
Roger, 1201 alarm.
Same type, we'll go, flight.
Okay, we're go. We're go, same type, we're go.
Flight sidle right on, real good. 2,000 feet, 2,000 feet, into the ag, 47.
Next up, once landed on the moon, the moonwalk still almost didn't happen. We saw in the movie that Armstrong and Aldrin had a little bit of trouble landing the lunar module on the moon, and that they almost ran out of fuel before they touched down. In real life, they overshot their mark by a lot, and they landed with about 25 seconds of fuel left. However, what we don't see is that even after landing, it still wasn't guaranteed that the astronauts would ever get to go outside the lunar module. After Armstrong announced to Mission Control,
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Mission Control went into a joyous uproar, though their celebration was left out of the film. Meanwhile, Armstrong and Aldrin stayed in the lunar module, completing tasks on their post-landing checklist. At this time, Mission Control was alerted by the lunar module's computer of a potentially dangerous pressure buildup in a descent engine fuel line. As Grumman Aerospace Corporation's Dick Dunn, a PR rep for the Apollo missions, recalled, the extreme cold from the lunar surface was creeping into the descent stage after engine shutdown. The cold permeated a fuel line and caused a blockage, which was immediately reported back by telemetry to Mission Control in Houston. That gave us cause for alarm. In other words, ice was blocking a fuel line, which could result in a number of outcomes, from nothing to a catastrophic explosion. Without the astronauts even being aware, Mission Control debated whether or not to abort the mission, but eventually the heat from the engine melted the ice and everything went back to normal. However, the problems didn't end there. The astronauts couldn't get the hatch open because there was too much air pressure in the lunar module, despite the fact they vented out all of the oxygen. Eventually, Aldrin was able to peel back one edge of the front hatch, and then Armstrong proceeded to head out. As he maneuvered his spacesuit in the cabin to get out of the lunar module, his backpack broke off the ascent engine's arming switch. If they couldn't get the engine armed, they'd be stranded on the moon. So what advanced technology saved them here? Well, as it turns out, Armstrong was able to flip the broken switch with the Fisher space pen he was using to take notes. I guess this is just one more instance where we can say the pen is mightier than the sword, and also all of NASA's science and technology. Well, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe down below. And if there's anything else that the movie left out concerning the moon landing that you know about, let me know in the comments. Or if you've just seen the movie and want to share what your opinion of it was, please do that as well. For now, remember, you are the villain in this movie we like to call life. And the sooner you realize that, the better it'll be for everyone. So go out there and make me some heroes. I'll see you next time. Generation Films, peace.